Ariel. Oh, there we go. It's on. Okay. I hope everyone enjoyed your food, and please feel free to go and get more dessert, coffee, and tea. But we're going to begin our program now, starting with some music, of course. And I'm very, very honored to be joined with Lorraine Reinhardt, is that how you say your last name? From Spirit of Life. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
You can find the words in your programs where it says Hine Matov.
And sing along as much as you're able.
Please join us. Yes.
Hine Matov u'monayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine Matov u'monayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine Matov shevet achim gam yachad. Hine Matov shevet achim gam yachad. Hine Matov u'monayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine Matov u'namayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine Matov shevet achim gam yachad. Hine Matov shevet achim gam yachad. Behold how pleasant, how good it is. Behold how pleasant, how good it is. How pleasant and harmonious when God's people are together. Fragrant as precious oil when running fresh on Aaron's beard. Behold how pleasant, how good it is. Behold how pleasant, how good it is.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. We will be back a little bit later with some more music, but first, the reason we are all gathered here today, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Carey Maier, who is a professor of New Testament and Early Christian Studies at the Vancouver School of Theology and a member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. For over a decade, he participated in the Vancouver Jewish Christian Dialogue, serving for 2 years as a co-chair. He dedicates much of his teaching and research to recovering and examining the Jewish roots of the New Testament and early Christianity. So please help me welcome Dr. Carey Maier.
I think the microphone is on, yeah? Can people hear me okay?
There it is,
Yeah?
there it is.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Well, it's wonderful to be here. It's not on? A little bit, much, a little higher. Is that on my tie? Is that better? Okay.
I can get it on my tie. Hard to see past my double chin. Okay. Oh, my glasses, there we go.
Okay, is that better? Is that better? People hear me? No? Still higher? Still higher? A little bit higher. Is that better? Is that better? Better, better? No, still not. Okay.
You can also take mine.
How's that? Is that better? Okay, well, I got some people saying yes. I got some people saying no.
If you can't hear him, you can grab one of the headsets and it'll make it louder for you.
Okay, I'm going to try that. Is that okay? Okay.
Try this
switch with you.
Let's see whether that works. Okay, take this off of here.
Very good. It's very light. Doesn't want to come out of my pocket. Okay.
one. Give this one a shot.
Okay, try that.
That's high.
Okay, is that better? Well, okay. Sound like the voice of God. Okay. It's delightful for me to be here with you today to talk about Paul and the law and the Jewish people. It's also a very difficult day to be here today, and I myself am feeling quite distracted and disoriented, so if I'm not quite as clear as I might otherwise be, I hope you'll excuse me. There are many things that are racing through our minds right now. I want to talk with you about how Christians, and specifically how Paul, who is one of the chief figures of Christianity and one of the important writers of the New Testament, view the Jewish law and viewed the Jewish law. I want to talk about how traditionally Paul has been understood over several centuries, and how really since the Shoah, Paul has been reinterpreted in a new way, in a way that I hope will be constructive for conversation in our midst here today. So for those of you who aren't Christians, who are Jewish, you'll know that there is the New Testament. The New Testament is divided up between 4 Gospels, and then a book of Acts, which is effectively the history of the early Jesus movement, the early church. And then there are 13 letters that were either written by Paul or are ascribed to Paul. And those letters make up really the bulk of the New Testament. Then after that comes letters from Peter and James and John and Jude and the book of Hebrews, and then the book of Revelation. But Paul's letters occupy a very prominent place in the New Testament. So what Paul has to say about the law and the Jewish people has been extraordinarily important, especially when the religion that Paul was promoting became Christianity, and Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. So Paul is extremely important. Now, if you had said to Paul when he was living, Paul, you're a Christian. Paul, you're the founder of a new religion called Christianity, Paul would have been completely perplexed and confused by what you might have said to him, because there really was no such thing as Christianity. The term Christianity is a term that appears for the first time in the 2nd century. And in the period before this, we have a movement that I think in differing ways and in various permutations conceives of itself as a form of Judaism. Now, when we talk about Judaism in the first 2 centuries, well, really, if we talk about Judaism up until the time of the Mishnah and up until the time of the Talmuds, right, Judaism is enormously diverse, is very variegated. We know, for example, we know about Pharisees who are Jews, we know about Sadducees who are Jews, we know about priests who are Jews, we know about Philo, who is a Jew, we know about the Tanaim, who were Jews, and we know about Qumran, we know about the Dead Sea community in Qumran that was sort of a movement of protest against the temple aristocracy. These are very differing forms of Judaism. So there is no thing called Judaism in the 1st century. There are Judaisms in the 1st century. In fact, there are Judaisms that continue right into antiquity. And of course, Rabbinic Judaism will eventually become normative Judaism, to which universally, I think, without much exception, Jews adhere to today, although there are many, many different interpretations of how rightly to interpret the Talmud, how rightly to interpret Jewish law, how rightly to practice Jewish law, and so on and so forth. So there is a wide variety of Judaisms. Christianity has similarly been various and variegated through the centuries. While Christians may speak of one Christianity, there have been multiple Christianities. And if we take a look at the Christian church today, we can see that there is Roman Catholicism. We can see that there are Protestant traditions, which number in their thousands now. And then we can talk about Greek Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy, Syrian Orthodoxy, Ethiopian Orthodoxy, and so on and so forth. So just as there are many Judaisms, so there are many, many Christianities. Okay, so what I want to talk about when we talk about Paul then, is we need to understand that Paul in his own context is a Jewish person who thinks that he is interpreting Judaism, or the tradition of Israel, in the light of what he conceives to be the revelation of God as revealed in Jesus of Nazareth. This makes him a remarkable Jew. It may make, and obviously he's a Jew with whom many people disagreed, and he disagreed with many people as well. But if I understand Judaism correctly, Judaism is not a religion in which people necessarily agree about everything all the time. So Paul was a Jew who had a particular interpretation of the tradition of Israel in the light of the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. So whenever we want to talk about Paul then, we need to understand what Paul has to say as it relates to the death and the resurrection of Jesus. So that's the first thing I want to say. So the second thing I want to talk about now is I want to talk a little bit about how Paul's understanding of Judaism was interpreted through the Reformation and into early modernity. And then I want to talk about how Paul's interpretation of Judaism has been reinterpreted, or understanding of Judaism has been reinterpreted, especially since the Holocaust. So when Christianity became an imperial religion, Christianity underwent a process of more or less large-scale systematization. That is to say, Christianity was developed into a system of teachings, into a system of ritual practices, and so on, that were seen to be self-consistent within themselves, and which together then formed the basis of a dominant religion of the Roman Empire and what would eventually become Western and Eastern Europe. So once Paul was incorporated into a thing called the New Testament, which unfolded over several hundred years, over the 3rd and 4th centuries especially, once Paul was incorporated into the New Testament, there was an attempt then, I think, to read the entirety of the New Testament in a kind of a systematic way, so that the New Testament, many writings written in different times, different places, by different people with different concerns, were then seen to be basically telling the same kind of story and basically the same interpretation of the consequences of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Again, if somebody had told Paul that one day there would be a New Testament and that his letters would form or letters attributed to him would form the basis of a thing that Christians would call the New Testament, he would have been extraordinarily surprised by that. Because Paul believed, the historical Paul believed, that he was living at the end of the age, that the world was about to come to an end, and that God was about to keep all of God's promises to the people of Israel by establishing Israel as a first amongst all nations, with the God of Israel being the God of all nations. And Paul believed that all of this was going to happen during his lifetime. Well, of course that didn't happen. And instead, what developed was this system of theology. So in this system of theology, the interpretation of the Jewish law is roughly as follows. So firstly, when Paul is talking about the Jewish law, he's primarily talking about the commandments. So he's not talking about the rituals, the sacrifices, etc. He's really talking about the commandments, and specifically he's talking about the 10 commandments. Okay, so the way that Paul came to be interpreted by his early interpreters, really roughly from the 4th century onward, can be understood that Paul presented a threefold understanding of the law. So this is just sort of a classic Christian Reformation. When I say the Reformation, I mean a movement of reform of Christianity that unfolded in the 16th century by Martin Luther, John Calvin, and a number of others. So in this period, the law then is understood in a threefold manner. What we call the first use of the law, the second use of the law, and the third use of the law. None of these terms are terms that Paul would have used, and I would argue that none of these terms or concepts are necessarily what Paul even would have recognized as his own. But what's important about my story here is how Paul came to be interpreted over time as part of a systematic body of Christian theology. So the first use, the second use, and the third use of the law. And this is going to be very important for how we have come to understand Paul and the law in a new way since the Shoah. Okay, first use, second use, third use of the law. So the first use of the law is that the law shows us our need for forgiveness. The law shows us our need for grace and forgiveness. So basically what the law does is the law is a mirror, and we look into the law, at the law, the 10 Commandments as a mirror, and what does this mirror reflect back to us? It reflects back to us that we can't keep the law. That we wake up in the morning, we want to keep the commandments, but by the time after we've brushed our teeth, we've already started to break the commandments. So the law shows us our need for grace and mercy. So in this understanding, the law is understood as a series of demands. You shall not. You shall honor your father and mother. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not covet. You shall not have any other gods before me. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And so on. So the law then basically outlines a series of prohibitions of what you must not do. Connected with this idea is the idea that God is a holy God and God is an exacting and just God, so that people who don't keep the law and don't follow God's commandments then are worthy of condemnation and of destruction. So the only way then that one can be freed from the guilt that the law produces through reading the law is through some kind of sacrifice. And this sacrifice then, in this understanding, is a sacrifice that is made by Jesus, who died on the cross for sins, so that now those who have faith in Jesus, they are freed from the condemnation of the law, and they have eternal life. So this is very, very important then for the classical Pauline understanding of the law. The first use of the law is there as a mirror and to show us our need for mercy, and mercy that is found primarily through the death and resurrection of Jesus. The second use of the law is to keep order. So there are traffic lights, for example. Red means stop, green means go. If everybody just drove down the road on whatever lane they wanted to and went through traffic lights any way they wanted to, there would be mass chaos. So the second purpose of the law, or the second use of the law, is to keep order, to keep the trains running on time, if you will. The third use of the law is what is called a transformative use of the law, which is to say that after one has become a Christian, the laws then take on a new function in helping to shape discipleship, holiness, a good life, and obedience to God, right? So the third use of the law, transformative use of the law, is for Christians, and the law outlines then what the good, God-fearing life is going to look like. So here we have then the first use of the law, the second use of the law, and the third use of the law. So I'm going to read you something from Paul's letter to the Romans to illustrate how the first use of the law has been interpreted from Romans chapter 7. So Paul wrote these letters. Probably the last letter that he personally wrote was the letter to the Romans, and he wrote that somewhere around 60 CE while preparing for a trip to Rome. Okay, and here we can see outlined how early systematic theologians of Paul interpreted Paul promoting the first use of the law, namely to expose our sin and our need for forgiveness. And I'm reading this now from chapter 7 onward. Let me see here. Right. There's a rhetorical question that Paul asks, and we're not going to stop there. So just bear with me as I read some of this stuff. It's pretty dense, because Paul may be guilty of many things, but clarity is not necessarily one of the things that he can be accused of. He is rather unclear. Right. What shall we say? I'll say this. Likewise, my brethren, you have died to the law through the body of Christ, that you may belong to one another, to him who has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit for God. While we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now we are discharged from the law, dead to that which held us captive, so that we serve not under the old written code, but in the new life of the Spirit. What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I should not have known sin. I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had said, you shall not covet. If God didn't tell you, do not steal, you wouldn't have thought, wow, stealing something, that sounds like a great idea. Okay. And sin, finding opportunity in the commandment, wrought in me all kinds of covetousness. You shall not covet, so it created covetousness in me. Apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. The very commandment which promised life proved to be death to me. For sin, finding an opportunity in the commandment, deceived me, and by it killed me. So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and just and good. Did that which is good then bring death to me? By no means. It was sin working death in me through what is good, in order that sin might be shown to be sin, and through the commandment might become sinful beyond measure. So Paul is basically saying, right, what the law does is it outlines a way that leads to life, but this phenomenon, which he describes as sin, uses the law to put bad desires in you, right? You shall not covet. Coveting, that sounds like a great idea. You shall not commit adultery. Wow, that sounds like an interesting thing I might try someday. And so on and so forth. Okay, so the law is good, but what sin does is it uses something good for bad purposes. We all know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. Now he says this, I do not know my own actions, for I don't do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good. So then it is no longer I that do it, but sin which dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now if I do what I don't want to do, It is no longer I who do it, but sin which dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin which dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, I of myself serve the law of God with my mind, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin. See, so what Paul is saying there is that God gives commandments, but this phenomenon, sin, takes the commandments and turns them into an opportunity or a way to creatively do bad things. So what the law does then is, while it is intended to bring life, in fact, the law functions as a mirror to show what happens when sin takes over, using the law to do bad things. So Paul here, the speaker, finds himself in a quandary. I don't do the thing I want to do, but I do the thing I don't want to do. So there's a war going on inside of myself. How will I escape this war going on inside of myself? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ. So what the law does then, according to this understanding of Paul, is that the law creates a human dilemma, if you will, a crisis of conscience. And the only way out of this crisis of conscience is for there to be a remedy, and that remedy of a crisis of conscience comes through Jesus Christ. So on this understanding then, how the law functions, especially from the Reformation period onward, is that the law functions to show people how wicked they are. But let's say you're a Jew living in 16th century Europe, where this interpretation of the law is sort of like the normative way that Christians understand, how Christians should understand the Old Testament law, its prescriptions, its requirements, and so on and so forth. And let's say you then have a synagogue down the road, and what the people do at the synagogue is they read Torah, and they offer commentary on Torah, and then they seek, as children of Torah, to do good deeds, because that's what Torah enjoins, right? What are you going to think if you're a Protestant Christian? What you're going to think is, those Jews in that synagogue, they don't understand what the law really is or what the law really does. In fact, they think that if they keep the law, that will show that they are God's people. And not only that, but if they can show that they're God's people, that then they have earned God's love and favor, not knowing that their very desire to do those things is a form of arrogance and self-righteousness. They don't know Jesus, and they are deluded about the law, right? So Martin Luther tragically believed that Jews had this system, and he tragically believed that once, because he was a reformer of the Roman Catholic Church, that once the reform of the Roman Catholic Church had come into being, that the true gospel would then be recovered, that Jews would then hear the true gospel, and that they would convert to Christianity. Of course, that didn't happen. And so at the end of Luther's life, he wrote some truly despicable treatises that were republished by the Nazis, in which he called for the violence against Jews and so on. So he became a sort of a foundation stone in Reformation anti-Judaism, which eventually turned into anti-Semitism. If somebody had taken Luther aside and said, well, Martin, you've just got a fundamental problem here. Your working assumption is completely wrong. Jewish people don't think that they can keep the law in order to earn God's forgiveness. Rather, Jewish people think of the Torah as a sign of God's election of them as the people of God, and they celebrate the law as part of their identity, their cultural, religious, historical identity. Far from thinking about earning their salvation, in fact, Jews really don't think about salvation very much the way that you do, dear Martin. Sorry to confuse you. Jews are not sort of defective Christians. Well, unfortunately, there was nobody there to tell Martin Luther how many Jews thought about the law. And as a consequence of that, several hundred years of systematic theology developed, arising already in the early church, that continued to promote this idea of Judaism as sort of this religion of self-righteous people that try to prove how much they are deserving of God's love by doing good deeds and by keeping Torah. How much time have I got here? Okay. Okay. So, this hat is falling off my bald head. This kippah is falling off my bald head. Okay, I need a suction cup on there or something. Okay. Let's now turn to the Shoah, and let's turn to what happened with interpretation of Paul post-Shoah. So, after the Shoah, many theologians, Roman Catholic and Protestant, returned to Paul because they were asking the question, is there anything in Christianity that helped to promote or helped to create a situation that could produce the Holocaust? Is there anything within Christianity itself that is to blame for the Holocaust? Well, they could look at Luther's treatise on the lies of the Jews. His treatise was called The Lies of the Jews. They could look at Luther's treatise and they could see how the Nazis made that kind of required reading for people, reproduced it in hundreds of thousands of copies and so on and so forth. They could look at that. They could ask, well, is Martin Luther then responsible for or a contributor to the Shoah and so on? Well, the conclusion that came was, I think we need to read Paul's letters again. And we ought not to read Paul's letters as though Paul was a proto-Christian. We should rather read Paul's letters in the light of his own Judaism. So the attempt then to understand the role of the Ten Commandments and the law more broadly speaking in the interpretation of Paul after the Shoah, right, was to understand the law as functioning in a very, very different way from the classic uses of the first use of the law, the second use of the law, and the third use of the law. Post-Shoah New Testament scholars said, well, that's all very interesting from the perspective of systematic Christian theology, right, for now 1,500 years. But just because Christianity developed that way doesn't necessarily mean that it's fully and faithfully grounded in what Paul actually said and what Paul actually taught. Now, that's a very revolutionary thing to kind of say, right? So now there's all these New Testament scholars who are saying Martin Luther was wrong, John Calvin was wrong, right? The way that Augustine thought about early Christianity is wrong. This has to be completely and totally reformulated. Now, the first thing that was understood was that the law is not understood and was not during Paul's day understood as a set of demands that people needed to accomplish to do God's will. The law, rather, was a gift from God. We might say in Christian parlance, an unmerited gift of God. There's nothing, I know the rabbis debate about this. What was it about Abraham that resulted in God calling Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees? I know the rabbis talk a lot about this, right? But maybe there is nothing about Abraham. Maybe it's just that God just said, hey, you, come with me, type thing. Just as a sign of, I'm God, I can do what I want, and this is who I choose. So there, right? But the point here from a Christian perspective is that God initiates a relationship with a group of people who will become Israel, and God then gives Israel the commandments. God gives Israel the land. God sends Israel the prophets. God gives Israel the means to engage in rituals for forgiveness and so on and so forth. Why does God do this? Because God wants Jews to prove how righteous they are and to earn salvation so that when they die, they go to heaven? No. God does this because God loves Israel. Because God has loving kindness, hesed, loving kindness towards Israel. That's why God does that. So that's the first point. Second point. Well then, what is Paul talking about when he says, through the law came knowledge of sin and death? What is he on about right there? Was Paul confused? Was he crazy? Was he just kind of hopelessly inconsistent within himself? Was he a tortured soul? So the answer to those questions are yes, according to several New Testament scholars. According to several New Testament scholars, there's been a wide variety of answers to this. But another suggestion has been this. Paul, when he's talking about the law, he's not talking about Jewish people. He's not talking about Jews needing to keep the commandments in order to earn God's love and so on and so forth. Rather, when God is talking about the law, he's rather talking about non-Jews. And the non-Jews that he's talking about would have been, using the terms of the categories at home in the Judaisms that we're talking about now, Gentile idolaters. Right, so the Gentiles, of course, are non-Jews, right? And idolaters, right? They're understood as Gentile idolaters. Why are the Gentiles idolaters in the Hellenistic world, in the Greek and Roman world? Because the Gentiles worship many, many gods. And so they break the first commandment, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. And in doing that, they show their separation from God. So, what's a God going to do? 2 minutes. So, Paul asks, is God the God of Jews only? Is God the God of Jews or Israel only? By no means, he says. God is the God of both Jews and Gentiles. Right, because what kind of God in the ancient world, and even in early Judaism, there was a view that there were many gods, right? And that Israel's God is the top God. So all the other gods are going to look at God and say, what kind of God are you? You've only got this group of people here, 6 million people in the Roman Empire, but what about the other 58 million people in the Roman Empire who don't worship you? You're sort of like a bit of a miserable God, aren't you? You're by no means the top God that you claim you are, right? So Paul then talks about the Jesus event, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, as a means by which then non-Jews are incorporated into God's covenant with Israel. And they're incorporated into God's covenant with Israel on this view, not by keeping the commandments, right? But rather through another agency, which is through the death and the resurrection of Jesus. So in this view, what Paul has to say about the law is not a universal statement for all of humankind everywhere and at all times. On this view, what Paul has to say about the law in his letters is specific to not Jews, but rather to Gentiles. Now, after the Holocaust, this new interpretation of Paul really urged New Testament scholars to reconfigure everything they had thought about Paul, everything they had thought about Judaism, and also everything that they ought to think about what Christianity is all about. I'll stop there.
Hold on. There it is. Thank you so much for sharing those historical perspectives, reinterpretations, and clarifying some really important points. Shirley? Over to you.
Thank you, Cantor, Shani. Thank you, Dr. Harry Maier. Please, another round of applause. I have learned so much in 30 minutes. It's incredible. I hope this is being recorded and I can rewatch it because there's a lot to unpack.
That's a lot.
And I have a ton of questions.
I bet.
As I'm sure some members of the audience too. So as we take a moment to reflect on everything we heard, I want to introduce you to Cantor Shani Cohen and her equivalent from Spirit of Life, Cantor Lorraine, Reinhardt. They're going to perform for us as we transition to the next part. Please write down your questions because we're going to have a chance to talk among ourselves, but also ask Dr. Maier some things that may want to clarify.
We're going to just switch up the microphones if I can grab that. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Okay. And thank you so much to Joseph Stacy for being here and accompanying us. How about now? Okay. Some of you may recognize this piece by one of our Temple Shalom members, Joan Becko, who wrote a lot of beautiful music for our congregation and for the world.
Can you see me?
Trying to turn it on. There it goes. There it goes.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable unto thee, O Lord.
And the meditation
I only pray for you to hear me. Listen, Lord, listen to me. Blessed Lord, may this song full of praises that I sing to thee be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord.
Lord, may this song full of praises that I sing to
thee for you to hear me. Acceptable. Listen, Lord, listen to me. Listen. Guard my tongue from evil, all evil, my lips from speaking guile.
Purify my heart from malice, give me shelter from pride.
Teach me how to reflect on the the journey of my soul.
Hear my spirit sing, how clear to me this struggle to find you in all I may do.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable unto thee, O Lord.
And the meditations
I
of my
only
heart
pray for you to hear me.
acceptable.
Listen, Lord, to the words of my mouth and my meditation.
Okay, so we're going to move to the dialogue, questions, and reflections portion. So we really wanted to make this event, this series of events, this first part of 2 parts about dialogue and inspiring conversations. So hopefully, I think people are sitting with some people that are new, and hopefully you can meet people across your table to talk about what we just heard about, as well as reflecting on any of these questions at the front of your program that you were inspired by or curious about. And we'll take a few minutes to do that. Anything else? Yeah, and then we'll have a chance for questions in a few minutes. So discuss.